My name is Elaine Whitfield, and on the night that was supposed to mark 20 years of my marriage, my husband stood in front of everyone I loved, took another woman's hand in front of our own daughter, and told 200 people that I was the reason he had stopped being happy long before that night ever began. He said it with a smile on his face. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed. Nobody in that room laughed. Nobody moved. And somewhere behind my ribs, a version of me that had been waiting patiently for 3 weeks finally exhaled. 3 hours earlier, none of us could have imagined how that evening would end. The ballroom at Whitfield Premier Motors was filled with gold light, a string quartet, and 200 guests who had come to celebrate two things at once: our 20th wedding anniversary, and the company rebranded my husband Marcus had spent the better part of a year building his name around. I stood near the entrance in a navy dress I had chosen weeks earlier, watching our daughter Sophie greet guests with the kind of pride only a child who believes her parents are happy can have. What none of them knew, what even Marcus did not know, was that I had already made a phone call 3 weeks before that night, and it was a call that was not going to wait politely for his toast to finish. When Marcus took the microphone, the room quieted the way a room does when people expect something warm. He thanked our guests. He thanked our investors. He turned toward me, raised his glass the way he had every anniversary for 20 years, and for one breath it felt like any other year we had shared. Then his eyes moved past me and settled on a woman standing just behind his shoulder in a red dress I recognized from company events. A woman not yet 30, and once his eyes found her, they did not come back to me. He kept talking. His voice grew warmer, softer, aimed at someone who was not his wife. What he said next was not an accident, and it was not a slip of the tongue after too much champagne. He told the room, in front of our daughter, in front of the investors who had built their trust in him over 2 decades, that he had felt trapped in our marriage for years, that he had only stayed out of duty, and that it was standing beside him, in that red dress, that had finally reminded him what it felt like to want to come home. He gestured toward her when he said it. He did not once look at me. I heard a woman gasp somewhere to my left. I heard glass touch a table too hard. I did not move. I am not going to tell you what happened in the 10 seconds after he finished speaking, or what I said when I finally set my own glass down and walked toward that stage. Not yet, because before I tell you what I did in that ballroom, you need to understand what I had already done outside of it, weeks earlier, quietly, without a single person in that room suspecting a thing. You need to understand who Marcus really believed he was about to become, and why every plan he had built for that night, the company, the marriage, the woman in red, was standing on ground that had already started to give way beneath him. He didn't know that in 48 hours, the company, the house, and the woman standing beside him would all be gone, and I'd be the reason. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a marriage that lasted 20 years fell apart in a single toast, and how a company that had taken decades to build could disappear in 2 days, you have to go back further than that ballroom. You have to meet the people standing inside it before that night ever happens to them. Because everyone in that room believed they already knew the story. They believed Marcus Whitfield was a self-made man who had built something remarkable, that his wife had simply stood beside him for the ride, and that the woman in the red dress was nothing more than a passing mistake a powerful man makes when he stops being careful. Almost none of that was true, and by the end of this story, you will understand exactly how wrong they all were. There are three questions sitting at the center of everything that happened that night, and I want you to hold on to them, because every answer arrives later than you expect. The first question is simple. Why would a man humiliate his own wife in front of 200 witnesses on the one night meant to celebrate her, instead of doing it quietly, privately, the way most men who want to leave a marriage choose to do it? The second question is harder to answer, and it is one even Marcus never thought to ask himself that night. What did his wife already know, sitting 3 feet away from him, that made her face so still while everyone else in that room was gasping? And the third question is the one that will not fully make sense until the very end. What actually happened in the 48 hours after that toast? Hours that took everything Marcus believed belonged to him and left him with almost nothing. To most people who knew them, Elaine Whitfield was simply Marcus's wife. She had no title at the company that bore both their history and only one of their names. She rarely appeared in interviews, rarely stood for photographs, and had spent 2 decades quietly becoming invisible inside a life she had helped build from nothing. Marcus, on the other hand, was the face people recognized, the man magazines called a self-made success story, the man investors trusted with their money because he had never once given them a reason not to. What almost none of them knew was where the first dollar of that success had actually come from, or whose name had been on the paperwork before his ever was. Then there was Bianca Reyes, 30 years old, sharp, ambitious, and rising quickly through the marketing side of Marcus's company over the 18 months before that gala. To the guests in that ballroom, she was simply an employee who had gotten too close to her boss, a familiar story that plays out in offices everywhere. But familiarity is exactly what allows people to stop asking questions. And in this story, the questions people stopped asking were the ones that mattered most. Nobody wondered where certain funds had gone. Nobody wondered why a junior director suddenly lived somewhere she should not have been able to afford. Elaine wondered, and she had been wondering quietly for months. What made that night different from every ordinary story of a husband and a younger woman was not the humiliation itself. Humiliation like that happens in marriages more often than anyone wants to admit, and most of the time, the wife absorbs it, cries somewhere private, and tries to rebuild whatever is left. But Elaine Whitfield did not cry that night, and she did not go home to rebuild anything, because she had already stopped building anything for Marcus 3 weeks earlier. What she had started building instead was something none of the 200 people in that ballroom, including her own husband, saw coming until it was already too late to stop. To understand what I set in motion 3 weeks before that toast, you have to go back much further than that, back to a version of Marcus and me that almost nobody at that gala had ever met. 22 years ago, I was Elaine Headley, not Elaine Whitfield, and Marcus was a 26-year-old salesman working the lot of a used car dealership on the edge of Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind of place with plastic flags snapping in the wind and a manager who underpaid every person on staff. He was not wealthy. He was not connected. What he had, even then, was a way of making you believe whatever he said next was the truth. A gift that would carry him further than most people's entire education ever could. I met him on a Tuesday afternoon when my father sent me to that lot to price out a truck for his hardware supply business. And Marcus spent 40 minutes talking to me about an engine I barely understood, watching my face rather than the truck the entire time. My father, Walter Headley, had built a small chain of hardware and supply stores across the Southwest with nothing but discipline and a refusal to ever owe anyone money he could not immediately repay. He taught me to read a balance sheet before I learned to parallel park, and he did not trust charm, because charm, in his words, was simply confidence wearing a disguise. He liked Marcus anyway. That should have told me something. We married 2 years after that Tuesday afternoon, in a small ceremony my father paid for without complaint, and for a while, our life together looked exactly like what two young people building something from nothing is supposed to look like. Marcus talked constantly about owning his own lot instead of working for someone else's, about building something with his name on it, and I believed every word of it, partly because I loved him, and partly because I had grown up watching my father do exactly that. What Marcus did not know yet was that my father had quietly begun watching him too, the way careful men watch the people who are about to marry their only daughters. 6 months before my father died, he sat me down without Marcus in the room and told me he wanted to help us start the dealership Marcus kept talking about, but only on one condition. The money would not go to Marcus. It would go into a trust in my name, structured so that the founding ownership stake in whatever business it built could never be sold, diluted, or transferred without my signature, regardless of what happened in my marriage. I remember being embarrassed by the idea at the time, certain it was an old man's unnecessary caution about a marriage that was never going to need protecting. I signed the paperwork anyway, mostly to make him comfortable. I did not understand yet how much that single signature would matter. 20 years later, my father died of a heart condition 4 months after that conversation, quickly enough that he never saw the dealership open, and I have spent every year since wondering whether some part of him already knew he was running out of time when he insisted on that clause. The seed money became a small lot with 12 used vehicles and Marcus's name on the sign, and over the following 2 decades, that lot became Whitfield Premier Motors, a group of luxury dealerships spread across 3 states, built almost entirely on Marcus's talent for making people feel certain about decisions they had not yet made. Nobody outside our immediate family ever knew where that first dollar had actually come from, or under what terms. As the company grew, so did the distance between the man people saw and the man I lived with. Marcus became the person magazines wanted to interview, the name printed on donor walls at charity galas, the face standing in front of new dealership openings, while I stood somewhere just outside the photograph. At some point in our marriage, without either of us ever formally deciding it, I became the person who managed our home, raised our daughter Sophie, and stayed almost entirely out of the company's public life, while Marcus became the only Whitfield the outside world ever needed to know existed. I told myself for years that I preferred it that way. Some of that was even true. Sophie was born 18 years into a story that already looked, from the outside, like a success nobody could argue with. She grew up believing her parents had built something together, and in the most literal financial sense, she was right, even if almost nobody, including Sophie herself, understood exactly how true that was. She adored her father, the way daughters often adore fathers, who are charming in public and generous with attention when they choose to give it. And she and I had the kind of relationship where she would tell me things she never thought to tell him. That relationship would matter more than either of us realized in the 2 days I am about to describe to you. The first quiet crack in our marriage appeared long before Bianca Reyes ever set foot inside Whitfield Premier Motors, though I did not recognize it as a crack at the time. Around year 15, Marcus began treating certain financial conversations as things I no longer needed to be part of, gently redirecting questions about company spending with the kind of warm confidence that made pressing further feel unreasonable. I remember asking him once, almost in passing, about a dealership renovation budget that seemed unusually high, and watching him answer so smoothly, so completely, that I forgot I had even asked a real question. I did not think of that moment again for years. I think of it constantly now. 18 months before that anniversary gala, Marcus hired a new director of marketing to lead what he called the most important rebrand in the company's history, a woman named Bianca Reyes. She was 30 years old, unusually sharp, and had come from a competitor with a reputation for turning tired regional businesses into brands people actually talked about online. I want to be clear about something, because it matters how this story unfolds. Bianca was not simply decorative. She was genuinely good at her job, which is precisely why nobody around Marcus questioned how quickly she rose, or how much unsupervised authority he began giving her over budgets that had nothing to do with marketing at all. Over the following year, I watched my husband's schedule fill with trips I could not always account for, dinners described as necessary for the rebrand, and a warmth toward Bianca in meetings I occasionally sat in on that felt different from the warmth he showed anyone else at that company. I told myself, more than once, that I was imagining things, that a man does not stay married for 20 years and then suddenly becomes a stranger without some clearer sign than a tone of voice in a conference room. I kept telling myself that until the morning I found a hotel receipt in a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner, from a city Marcus had told me 3 days earlier he had never actually traveled to that month. I did not confront him that morning, and I want you to understand why, because it says more about what came next than almost anything else in this story. I had grown up watching my father handle every serious problem the same way, quietly, patiently, and only after he had every fact in hand, because a confrontation without proof simply teaches the other person to hide better. I was not ready to accuse my husband of anything I could not yet prove, and some instinct I could not name told me that if I was wrong about what I suspected, confronting him with nothing but a receipt would only humiliate me and teach him to be more careful. So instead of asking Marcus a single question, I made a different decision entirely. I picked up my phone and I called someone whose name had never once come up at any dinner party we had ever hosted. The name I gave that morning belonged to a man named Thomas Bell, a forensic accountant a former college friend had once mentioned in passing, the kind of person hired quietly by families who need answers before they need lawyers. I told him almost nothing at first, only that I wanted a careful, discreet review of certain accounts I had every legal right to examine, given the trust my father had left behind 2 decades earlier. Thomas asked very few questions that first week. He simply started reading, the way a good investigator reads, without assuming he already knew the ending. For the first month, he found almost nothing unusual, which in a strange way worried me more than a clear answer would have. Ordinary spending, ordinary payroll, ordinary vendor invoices, the kind of financial noise that exists inside any company large enough to have departments. Then, quietly, he began pulling threads specifically from the marketing budget, the one department where spending had grown the fastest over the past 18 months, the same 18 months that lined up almost exactly with Bianca Reyes joining the company. He did not tell me what he suspected. He simply told me he needed more time, and I gave it to him. 6 weeks in, Thomas found a vendor listed across dozens of invoices under the name Meridian Fleet Consulting, a company that, on paper, had been paid more than $600,000 over roughly 2 years for services that were never clearly defined beyond vague phrases like strategic consulting and brand logistics. When he searched for Meridian Fleet Consulting outside of our own company's records, he found almost nothing. No other clients, no public filings that made sense for a business supposedly this active, no physical office anyone could verify. A company that is real enough to receive $600,000 should leave more of a footprint in the world than that one had left. It took him another 2 weeks to trace the account those payments actually flowed into, and when he finally showed me the paperwork, my hands were steady in a way I still find strange to remember, because some part of me had already stopped being surprised by anything Marcus did. The account belonged to a residential address downtown, a condominium purchased 11 months earlier, and the name attached to both the account and the deed was Bianca Reyes. Money meant for consulting services that did not appear to exist had, in reality, purchased an apartment for the woman my husband had spent the last year growing closer to in every meeting I had watched from the edges of the room. Even with that discovery in hand, Thomas was careful to remind me it was not enough, not in the way that mattered most. Marcus could still claim, credibly, that Bianca had exploited her position, that vendor approvals of that size moved through several layers of the company, and that he had simply trusted the wrong person the way any busy chief executive eventually trusts the wrong person. Proving the money moved was not the same as proving Marcus knew exactly where it was going and approved of it anyway. Thomas told me, plainly, that without proof of what he called intent, the entire story could still end with Marcus walking away relatively unharmed and Bianca alone absorbing the consequences. It took 3 more weeks of careful, patient searching through digital approval records. Records I again had every legal right to request, given the structure my father had built, before Thomas found what we needed. Buried inside an internal finance system were 2 separate instances where Marcus himself had personally approved an override on Meridian Fleet Consulting's payment terms, once to accelerate a transfer and once to raise an approval limit that should have triggered additional review. His name was on both approvals, his password, his timestamp. There was no version of this story anymore where my husband simply trusted the wrong person. He had personally cleared the path for that money to move, twice, with his own hands. I remember exactly where I was standing when Thomas read me that final piece of evidence over the phone, in our kitchen, 3 weeks before the anniversary gala, looking out at a backyard Marcus and I had spent 15 years slowly building together. I did not cry. I did not immediately call a divorce attorney, or drive to the office, or do any of the things I imagine most people picture themselves doing in that moment. I called Diane Castellano instead, a woman who had handled my father's estate decades earlier, and had quietly remained my attorney ever since. Someone whose name had never once come up at a single dinner party Marcus and I had hosted in 20 years of marriage. Diane and I made a decision together that I have turned over in my mind many times since, and I still believe it was the right one. We would not confront Marcus privately first. I explained to her what my father had taught me about confrontations without proof, how a private accusation would only teach a guilty man to move his money faster and cover his tracks more carefully before anyone with real authority ever saw the evidence. Instead, we would finish building an airtight, complete report, quietly, and hold it ready to deliver the instant I gave the word, timed so precisely that Marcus would have no opportunity to hide anything further once it moved. For 3 weeks, I lived inside a version of my marriage that looked, from the outside, exactly like every other week of the previous 20 years. I made dinner. I answered questions about anniversary party seating charts. I watched Marcus rehearse portions of his toast out loud in our bedroom, practicing warmth he no longer felt for me and had already redirected somewhere else. I will not pretend those 3 weeks were easy. Carrying complete knowledge of your husband's betrayal while continuing to live beside him as though nothing has changed asks something of a person that I would not wish on anyone, and the only thing that made it bearable was knowing exactly when and how that silence would finally end. The night of the gala, I arrived already knowing things about the man beside me that none of the 200 guests filling that ballroom could have imagined. I watched Marcus greet investors with his usual warmth, watched Bianca move through the room in that red dress funded, in part, by money that had never legitimately belonged to her, and I felt something closer to steadiness than fear, the specific calm that comes only after a decision has already been made and simply needs its moment to arrive. Sophie squeezed my hand at one point and told me how happy she was that we had made it 20 years. I told her I loved her, because it was true, and because I had no idea yet exactly how she would need to hear that in the days ahead. When Marcus took the microphone and began his toast, I already knew, in a way nobody else in that room did, that nothing he said next could actually hurt me the way it once would have. He thanked our guests. He thanked our investors. He turned toward me and raised his glass exactly as he had every year, and for one strange breath, some old, worn-down part of me still hoped he might simply say something kind and let the evening pass quietly. Then his eyes moved past me, found Bianca standing just behind his shoulder, and stayed there. He told 200 people he had felt trapped in our marriage for years. He said standing beside her had reminded him what it felt like to want to come home. He did not once look back at me while he said it. I watched Sophie's face change first, the specific way a daughter's expression collapses when she realizes the father she trusted has just chosen to humiliate her mother in front of strangers for the sake of his own comfort. I watched investors who had shaken Marcus's hand an hour earlier lower their glasses slowly, uncertain whether to react at all. I did not cry, and I did not shout, because I had already spent 3 weeks grieving this exact moment privately, in a kitchen, on the phone with Thomas Bell, long before Marcus ever said a single word of that toast out loud. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity than heartbreak, the specific relief of finally being allowed to stop pretending. I set my glass down on the nearest table and walked toward the small stage where Marcus was still standing, still holding Bianca's hand, still smiling the smile of a man who believed he had just done something brave. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for the microphone the way people expect in moments like this. I simply stood close enough for him to hear me, and I told him, quietly, that I hoped he had enjoyed saying that, because it was the last thing he would ever get to say to a room like this one, as the man they all believed him to be. Then I turned, and I walked toward the exit, leaving him standing there, trying to understand what I meant. I did not look back once I reached the hallway outside the ballroom. I took out my phone, and with hands that were finally completely steady, I called Diane Castellano and said 3 words I had been waiting 3 weeks to say. Send it now. Behind me, through the closed doors, I could still hear the low, uncertain hum of 200 confused guests trying to decide whether to keep celebrating. Inside that ballroom, Marcus and Bianca had no idea that somewhere across town, an email was already leaving Diane's office, carrying 2 years of evidence toward a man who had trusted my husband longer than almost anyone alive. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Marcus and Bianca had already decided, between themselves, that the toast had simply been an uncomfortable moment at an otherwise successful evening, the kind of thing wealthy, confident people convince themselves will fade from memory within a week. They went to breakfast together that morning, at a small cafe near the office, still glowing from what they believed had been a bold, honest declaration of feelings too important to hide any longer. Neither of them checked the company email before 10 o'clock. Neither of them had any reason yet to believe that morning would be anything other than the beginning of a new, more comfortable chapter. David Okafor, on the other hand, had been awake since 5, sitting at his kitchen table with a laptop open in front of him and a cup of coffee slowly going cold beside it. David had co-founded Whitfield Premier Motors with Marcus 20 years earlier, had watched that first 12-car lot grow into a company spanning 3 states, and considered Marcus not simply a business partner, but the closest thing he had to a brother. When Diane Castellano's email arrived just after 4 that morning, David opened it expecting some minor legal formality. By the time he reached the 3rd page, his coffee was the last thing on his mind. The report Diane had sent laid out, in careful, unemotional language, 2 years of payments to a vendor called Meridian Fleet Consulting, the absence of any verifiable business behind that name, and the direct link between those funds and a residential purchase belonging to Bianca Reyes. David read it twice before he called anyone, partly out of disbelief and partly because he understood immediately that a mistake at this stage could ruin an innocent person's reputation just as easily as it could expose a guilty one. His first call that morning was not to Marcus. It was to the company's outside auditing firm, asking them, quietly and off the record, to verify whether a vendor by that name had ever had any legitimate operating presence at all. The auditors confirmed within hours what Thomas Bell had already spent weeks proving. Meridian Fleet Consulting had no employees, no other clients, and no physical business location beyond a mailbox rental service downtown. For a brief, uncomfortable stretch that morning, David allowed himself to consider the more forgiving version of this story, the one where Bianca alone had built an elaborate scheme and simply routed it past a trusting, overworked chief executive who had never personally noticed one vendor among thousands. It would have been easier, in almost every sense, for that version to be true. David had known Marcus for 20 years. He wanted, badly, to believe his oldest friend was only guilty of poor judgment rather than something far heavier. That comfortable theory lasted until nearly noon, When Diane Castellano, following the sequence she and I had planned weeks earlier, released the second half of the evidence to David directly. This portion contained the digital approval records Thomas had found, the two instances where Marcus himself had personally cleared payment overrides for Meridian Fleet Consulting, using his own credentials, at moments that left no reasonable room for accidental ignorance. David told me much later that he read those two approval records 4 separate times, as if repetition might eventually change what they said. It did not. Whatever version of this story he had hoped to believe by lunchtime had quietly stopped being possible. By early afternoon, David had moved from disbelief into the kind of controlled urgency that comes from 20 years of building something and suddenly realizing it may need protecting from the very person who built it beside you. He contacted the company's outside legal counsel to formally freeze the Meridian Fleet Consulting account before any further funds could move through it, a step that required almost no persuasion once the auditor's findings were laid beside Marcus's own digital signature. He then made the call that would set the rest of that evening in motion, requesting an emergency meeting of the full board for 6 o'clock, framed to Marcus only as an urgent financial matter requiring his immediate attention. Marcus received that call just after 2 in the afternoon, still at lunch with Bianca, still riding the particular high of a man who believes he has just been brave rather than cruel. Something in David's voice on that call, a formality that had not existed between them in 2 decades of easy friendship, left Marcus quiet for several seconds after he hung up. He told Bianca it was probably nothing, likely some minor cash flow question the finance team had escalated unnecessarily, and for the rest of that afternoon, he mostly believed his own explanation. It is a specific, painful kind of ordinary, the last few hours a person spends fully believing their life is still theirs. When Marcus walked into the boardroom at 6 o'clock, he later admitted to me he expected perhaps 20 minutes of routine discussion before returning home for the evening. What he found instead was Diane Castellano seated at the far end of the table, a woman he had not seen inside that building more than a handful of times in 20 years, along with the full board rather than the usual small finance committee, and David Okafor's face arranged into an expression Marcus had never once seen his oldest friend wear in their entire partnership. He told me later that he understood, within the first 30 seconds of entering that room, that this was not going to be a conversation about cash flow. David opened the meeting simply, laying the full report on the table and asking Marcus directly whether he recognized the vendor name Meridian Fleet Consulting. Marcus's first response was the one both David and the auditors had already anticipated that morning, an attempt to place the entire weight of the discovery onto Bianca alone, describing her as an ambitious young director who must have exploited gaps in the approval process without his knowledge. For a brief moment, several people around that table visibly wanted to believe him, the same way David had wanted to believe him 8 hours earlier, because the alternative implicated a man they had trusted with their own money for 20 years. That version of events survived for exactly as long as it took David to turn to the second page of the report and read aloud the timestamps beside Marcus's own digital approvals, the 2 moments where Marcus personally cleared payments to an account with no legitimate business behind it. The room went quiet in a way David told me he had never experienced in 2 decades of board meetings. Not the sharp silence of shock, but something heavier, the specific silence of people watching a story they had told themselves for years quietly finish falling apart. Marcus attempted to explain the approvals as routine, procedural, the kind of button he pressed dozens of times a week without close attention. Nobody in that room appeared to find that explanation as satisfying as he needed them to. Diane Castellano waited until the room had fully absorbed that discovery before she stood and asked for the board's attention one final time that evening. There was, she explained, one additional piece of information the board needed before any formal vote could move forward. Something that had nothing to do with the missing funds themselves, but everything to do with understanding exactly what authority Marcus did and did not actually hold within the company he had spent 20 years believing was entirely his own. Several board members exchanged uncertain glances. David simply nodded for her to continue, already sensing, correctly, that the story in that room was not yet finished revealing itself. What Diane explained next was something Marcus had known about in the vaguest possible way for 20 years, without ever fully understanding what it meant in practice, because it had simply never mattered until that evening. She described the trust my father had created before his death, the one that had funded the very first dealership lot, and the specific clause he had insisted upon before releasing a single dollar. The founding equity stake in whatever business that money built could never be sold, diluted, or unilaterally controlled without my direct signature, and it belonged, permanently, to me and my descendants rather than to the marriage itself. For 20 years, that clause had simply sat quietly in the background of a thriving company, unnecessary and largely forgotten. That evening, it stopped being background. Marcus sat perfectly still while Diane explained this, and David told me later that he watched something shift behind his old friend's eyes. The specific, sinking realization of a man discovering that the woman he had spent 2 decades treating as a quiet background presence in his own success story had held meaningful, protected authority the entire time. Authority he had simply never bothered to fully understand because he had never imagined needing to. It is a strange kind of humiliation, learning at your lowest moment that the person you dismissed for so long was never as powerless as you assumed, and I do not say that with cruelty, only because it is exactly what happened in that room. The board's vote that followed was not about the toast, and it was not about Bianca. Every director present understood clearly that removing a chief executive for personal betrayal alone would have opened the company to exactly the kind of messy, sympathetic backlash Marcus might have eventually survived. What they voted on instead was narrower and far more damaging: a documented breach of fiduciary duty, the misappropriation of company funds through a vendor with no legitimate business behind it, and 2 personally authorized approvals that left no room for claims of ignorance. The vote to remove Marcus as chief executive and chairman passed with only 1 abstention, and even that single abstention belonged to a board member, simply overwhelmed by the speed of what had just unfolded. Evada Koffer voted to remove him. He told me afterward that it was the hardest vote of his professional life, made harder by 20 years of friendship rather than easier, because loyalty to a person and loyalty to the truth had never once conflicted for him before that evening. Marcus, he said, did not argue when the final vote was read aloud. He simply sat in the chair he had occupied at the head of that table for 2 decades, looking, for the first time David could remember, like a much smaller man than the room had always made him appear. While that meeting was still unfolding, word reached Bianca through a source I have never been entirely certain of, though I suspect it came from someone inside finance who had noticed the frozen account earlier that afternoon. Whatever the source, she understood the essential shape of what was happening well before Marcus called to tell her himself. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to simply paint her as a villain and move on, but the truth is more specific than that, and more useful to understand. Bianca had spent 18 months building a relationship with a powerful man whose company appeared limitless, and the moment that power visibly began collapsing, whatever she had actually felt for him stopped being enough of a reason to stay. By the time Marcus finished that board meeting and finally reached his phone, he found several missed calls he had not noticed during the meeting, and a single message from Bianca that arrived roughly 40 minutes after the vote, informing him she had already retained her own attorney and would not be answering further calls without counsel present. She did not deny knowledge of the condominium or the vehicle purchased in her name. She simply made clear, in the fewest words possible, that she intended to protect herself rather than stand beside a man whose usefulness to her had just been formally revoked by an entire board of directors. I do not know exactly how Marcus felt in the minutes after reading that message, sitting alone in a parking garage that had, until that morning, belonged to a company that still bore his name on its letterhead. I know only what David told me, that Marcus called him twice more that night, and that David, for the first time in 20 years, did not answer either call. A man who had spent 2 decades believing himself the center of every room he entered, discovered, within the space of a single evening, that both the company and the woman he had chosen over his wife had already moved on without him, almost simultaneously, as though his presence in either story had always been more conditional than he understood. The following morning brought the second collapse, quieter than the first, but, in its own way, just as complete. A letter arrived from Diane Castellano's office, addressed to Marcus directly, explaining what he had never fully absorbed the previous evening in the noise of losing his title. The house we had lived in for 15 years, like the founding equity itself, had been placed inside the same family trust decades earlier, a decision my father had insisted upon before his death as a simple, quiet act of caution neither Marcus nor I had ever seriously discussed since. It had never truly been half his in the way marital property is normally understood to be shared. It belonged to the trust, and the trust, as it had for 20 years, answered only to me. I picture Marcus reading that letter alone in a kitchen that had been, 24 hours earlier, the setting for 2 decades of ordinary family mornings, and I will admit that some part of that image does not bring me the satisfaction I might have expected it to. There is very little triumph in watching someone you once loved discover, piece by piece, exactly how much of what he believed belonged to him had never actually been his to lose. There is only a kind of stillness, the particular quiet that follows a very long storm, once you finally understand it is over and you were never actually the one it destroyed. By the close of that second day, less than 48 hours after he had raised a glass in front of 200 people and told them he had finally found happiness, Marcus Whitfield had lost his position at the company he believed he built alone, the woman he had chosen over 20 years of marriage, and the house he had assumed would always be his, regardless of anything else that happened between us. He had lost all 3, in that exact order, faster than he had ever lost anything in his life, and every piece of it traced back, in one way or another, to decisions made decades earlier by a careful man he had once dismissed as unnecessarily cautious about a marriage he was certain would never need protecting. I learned of the board's vote from David himself, standing in my kitchen the next morning, his voice heavier than I had ever heard it in 20 years of holiday dinners and company celebrations. I did not celebrate when he told me. I remember standing very still, thinking instead of my father, of a Tuesday afternoon decades earlier when he sat me down and asked for a single signature I barely understood the weight of at the time. I thought about how a quiet, careful decision made by a man who never once raised his voice had ended up protecting me more completely, decades later, than any argument or accusation ever could have. There was still one conversation left that mattered more to me than anything happening inside that boardroom. One person, whose understanding of these 2 days I cared about far more than David's vote or Marcus's collapse. Our daughter had left that ballroom 2 nights earlier confused and hurting, uncertain which parent deserved her loyalty, and nothing that had happened inside a boardroom full of investors could tell me how Sophie was going to make sense of what her father had done, or what her mother had quietly built in response to it. Sophie called her father first, the morning after the gala, before any of this had reached the board, or the frozen accounts, or the letter about the house. She told me later that Marcus described the toast to her as an act of honesty rather than cruelty, insisting he had simply been unwilling to keep living a lie for our benefit, and framing whatever happened next as something I had chosen to escalate out of hurt pride rather than genuine wrongdoing on his part. For a few hours that morning, before the board meeting, before any of the financial truth had reached her, Sophie later admitted she had almost believed him. He had always been easier to believe than to question. She came to me that same afternoon, before the emergency board meeting had even begun, asking me directly whether I had truly done something to hurt her father, or whether there was more to this than a humiliated wife lashing out. I did not raise my voice, and I did not tell her a single unkind word about Marcus that I could not immediately prove. Instead, I sat with her at our kitchen table and showed her the report exactly as Thomas Bell and Diane Castellano had built it. The vendor with no real business behind it, the condominium, the 2 signed approvals bearing her father's own name. I let the documents speak for themselves because I trusted my daughter enough to draw her own conclusions once she had every fact in front of her. I watched something in Sophie's face change as she read through those pages, a shift I recognized because I had felt something similar myself weeks earlier in Thomas Bell's careful phone call. The affair alone, painful as it was, had at least been a familiar kind of betrayal, the sort of thing she might eventually have found a way to forgive with time. What she was reading instead was something colder, evidence that her father had personally authorized company money to fund a life with another woman while continuing to stand beside her mother at school events and holidays as though nothing had changed. She did not cry the way I expected her to. She simply closed the folder, looked up at me, and asked what she could do to help. By the time the board's vote reached her the following day, and the letter about the house arrived the morning after that, Sophie had already made her decision without needing either event to convince her further. She moved into the guest room of my sister's house alongside me for those first uncertain weeks. Not out of anger at her father exactly, but out of a clearer understanding than either of us expected her to reach so quickly, that choosing to stand beside the truth was not the same as choosing sides out of spite. She has told me since that watching me hand her that folder, rather than simply telling her what to believe, mattered more to her than almost anything else that happened during those 2 days. By the close of the second day, exactly as I had promised at the very beginning of this story, Marcus had lost his position at the company. The woman he had humiliated me for, and the house we had shared for 15 years. In that precise order, faster than any of us, including me, expected 2 days to actually move. He was left, in the end, with a name that no longer opened the same doors it once had, a reputation that would follow him into whatever came next, and a daughter who had chosen honesty over easy loyalty once she was finally given the chance to see the whole picture clearly. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story deserves more than a simple villain and a simple victory. I did not feel triumphant watching Marcus lose everything he had spent 2 decades building. I felt mostly tired, and beneath that tiredness, something quieter that took me weeks to properly name. Relief, not at his downfall specifically, but at finally being allowed to stop shrinking myself inside a marriage that had asked me, for years, to be smaller than I actually was. David Okafor came to me about a month after that gala, once the immediate legal matters had settled into their slower, formal pace, and asked whether I had any interest in starting something new, smaller, built on terms neither of us would ever need to question again. We did not rebuild Whitfield Premier Motors, and we did not attempt to simply replace what had been lost. Instead, we reopened a modest lot on the same stretch of road where Marcus had once sold used cars as a 26-year-old with nothing but charm and borrowed confidence, and we gave it a name that had nothing to do with either of our marriages. We called it Headley Motors, after a careful man who read balance sheets before he trusted anyone's smile. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in standing inside a small, honest business you built, without needing anyone else's permission to exist, and I have felt that quiet more mornings than I can count since we opened those doors. It is nothing like the ballroom that once held 200 people celebrating a version of success I no longer recognize as mine. It is smaller, slower, and entirely my own, in a way almost nothing in my life had been allowed to be for 20 years. I think often about what my father understood, decades before any of this happened, when he insisted on a clause neither of us believed we would ever need. He was not protecting me from Marcus specifically. He was protecting me from the simple, common possibility that trust, however genuine it feels in the moment, is not the same thing as security, and that a woman who quietly steps back from visibility for the sake of someone else's success should never have to depend entirely on that person's continued kindness to remain safe. I did not fully understand that lesson until the exact moment I needed it most. What Marcus did to me in that ballroom said very little about who I actually was, and almost everything about who he had already become long before that night. Humiliation, I have learned, rarely reveals the truth about the person receiving it. It reveals the truth about the person choosing to inflict it, about what they believe they can get away with, and about how little they think the person in front of them is capable of doing in response. Marcus believed, in that moment, that I was simply the quiet wife standing beside him for 20 years, someone who would absorb whatever he said and go home to grieve it privately. He was wrong about almost everything else that night, but he was most wrong about that. So I will leave you with the same two questions I have been asking myself since that evening. Was justice truly served in those 48 hours, or did Marcus simply lose a game he never understood he had been playing against someone he underestimated for 20 years? And if you had been sitting at one of those tables that night, watching a confident, charming man raise a glass to another woman in front of his own wife, would you have noticed anything unusual about the woman sitting quietly beside him? Or would you, like almost everyone else in that room, have looked straight past her too? If you were sitting where I was sitting that night, I would genuinely like to know what you would have done differently. Would you have confronted Marcus the moment you found that hotel receipt? Or would you have done exactly what I did and waited quietly until you held proof strong enough that no explanation could talk its way around it? There is no single right answer to that question, and I think the honest answer says something different about each of us. Tell me in the comments which version of that decision feels most like you, because I read every single one, and these conversations are often the part of telling this story that means the most to me. I also want to ask you something a little harder to sit with. How many quiet, easily explained moments have passed through your own life without you ever stopping to look at them twice, the way I almost did with that receipt? Most of us are taught to give people we love the benefit of the doubt, and most of the time, that instinct serves us well. But every story like this one begins with someone choosing, just once, to trust an explanation a little too quickly. I am not asking you to become suspicious of everyone around you. I am only asking whether this story made you think of a moment in your own life you had not quite looked at closely before. If this story kept you here until the very end, I have another one waiting for you that I think you are going to feel just as strongly. A story about a woman who spent years believing she had married the most honest man she knew. It carries the same kind of quiet, patient unraveling this story did, and I have a feeling it is going to stay with you the same way. Before you go, if you found any part of yourself in Elaine's story tonight, whether in her patience, her restraint, or simply the quiet ache of being underestimated by someone who should have known better, do me one small favor and subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications if you can, because these stories arrive regularly, and I would hate for you to miss the next one simply because it slipped past without you noticing it, the same way so much else in this story almost did. Thank you for staying with me through this one, from beginning to end. I will see you in the next story.